Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and this is Business Spotlight. Joining me today is Chris Chornohos, who is Vice President of Valuation and Advisory for Newmark. Thanks for joining us today, Chris.
Thank you, Mario.
Let's talk a little bit about the multifamily market in Canada. It's been awesome, as a way to put it. On fire over the last couple of years. Why is Canada such a great opportunity for owning and developing multifamily real estate right now?
Yeah, Canada has been for quite some time. And so it's a bit of a confluence of a couple of factors that have really been driving it. And it actually started, I shouldn't say it started, but there was a kind of an inflection point for Canada where during the financial crises and the crash that we saw in 2008, where the US and even Canada, to a lesser extent, we really were impacted by, the financial collapse. What was interesting for Canada, we didn't see the same, the same impacts that the US did in their housing markets, and actually Canada, fared quite well. And I think the rest of the world took notice of that, and they started to realize that Canada had a really strong banking system and financial stability that the US didn't have, and some of these other countries in Europe didn't have. And so the rest of the world saw Canada as this, safe haven for investment, whether it was real estate or, other asset classes. And so that was really kind of the start of Canada being put on the map, if you will. And so that investor interest led to a bunch of other factors, and now we're kind of this like I say, a confluence of events, which is really, immigration that's been driving population growth in Canada, lower, these low interest rates, especially due to the pandemic, which has been really juicing up rental rates and house prices. So that's been one of the key things that's been going on in this market.
Let's talk about population. What are the stats from the population standpoint that are driving this optimism in the multifamily market?
Yeah, it's as I was mentioning about immigration. So Statistics Canada puts out reports on a rolling basis and projects out how what the population of Canada and certain provinces and certain markets is going to look like based on their demographic information. And so the most recent statistics that they put out, they talked about what the population of Canada is going to look like in 20 years. And I think at the time it was 2043, and they've since updated it to 2046.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that 50% of all of the growth in population is between two provinces. So it's Ontario and Alberta. And so between those two provinces, which is a massive number when you think about it, Ontario makes sense. It's a big province. I found it interesting at Alberta, given all the troubles that we've seen and the oil collapse, and we've been losing population. But all that being said, they still project that Alberta will be part of that, a lot of that growth.
Yeah. So when we talk about population growth, we're looking at three different parts of it, right? Depending on where you are in the country.
Yeah.
You mentioned, immigration. We've got the natural population growth, right? And
yes.
And then the interprovincial movement of people. All those numbers point in a positive direction for certain provinces, right? And, I think Alberta recently showed quite well in the interprovincial migration, right?
Yes. Yeah, and I should say, and part of those stats that I mentioned, that report that they did, what was really interesting is that they project that Alberta will be bigger than BC in 20 years. And so, Alberta's at 4.5 million people, and they're projecting it between, depending on certain growth scenarios, high or low, and they rate it based on economic conditions, but anywhere between 6 million and up to 7.5 million people. So and then another part of that too is that between the prairie provinces in this 20-year time frame, the prairie provinces will actually be larger than Quebec's population. And so Quebec's population, much like Canada and a lot of G7 countries, were an older demographic. And so just with natural birth increases, it's just not growing as fast as, say, Alberta, which has a younger population.
Yeah.
And they also, then they look at certain regions within provinces. And I'm from Alberta, from Calgary, so 80% of that growth is going to happen in the Calgary economic corridor. So it bodes well if you're an investor in, say, Ontario and Alberta. But yeah, you asked about the three components. So yeah, it's immigration, natural increases, which is birth and that natural increase in population, and then interprovincial net migration. So Alberta, over the last couple of years has been losing in that sense with the interprovincial, but they've really ramped up over the last, and then Canada as a whole, since 2010, you can really see on the charts the proportion of the population growth that's tied to immigration. And so from 2010, you start to see it kind of slowly creep up. And then in 2015, it really ramps up. And that's what we've been seeing over this time. In 2021, we had the lowest, migration at, I think it was like 184,000 people. But in 2020, sorry, that was 2020. In 2021, Canada received the most immigrants we've ever received since 1913. And when I saw that stat, I thought, okay, what was happening in 1913? And I think that was one of the great world wars. And so that was like a big push to, people moving out of Europe. So that's quite the stat, when you look at that kind of growth.
Yeah, and Chris, can you talk about the lifestyle choice? It seems to me that more and more people, no matter where they are liking the idea of you're living in a multifamily environment. Can you talk about the factors of why that's happening?
Yeah, that has been a trend that's been, over the last, I would say, 10 years, that you're starting to see, multifamily as a housing option, or, rentals as a housing option become more palatable for a certain generation. And it's really the millennials, and then it's the baby boomers that maybe they saw their house prices, crash in 2008, and housing is not such a great investment. And they want that quality of life and ease of lifestyle that, say, a condo doesn't afford, but a rental really does. You have someone that manages the property, takes care of everything. Your costs are actually lower. So yeah, that's been a huge factor in the why rental rates are increasing, and all those other items for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about supply out there. With this growing demand in that market, does Canada and specific areas of Canada have enough of the multifamily residential to meet that demand?
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't. And there's a few studies that point to that. So Scotiabank recently, they did a study. They've been kind of tracking it, and they just published the most recent one here in January. And so first, Canada actually, on a housing unit per capita, has the lowest per capita housing unit in all of the G7 countries. So we're the last, below the UK, even the US. And so that, coupled with all these, we have, the new immigration coming in, and the fact that we're already undersupplied, it's really creating an issue for that equilibrium. So supply is definitely a factor. They state that Ontario alone needs to build, and when you talk about housing units, it's probably, depending on the province. Like, for example, Quebec's got more renters than homeowners. In Alberta, it's the other way. And so it's typically about 65, 35. And so when I say housing units, it's a combination of for sale and multifamily rentals. And Ontario alone needs 650,000 homes just to get to that equilibrium where we would be on par with some of the other G7 countries. Alberta needs 138,000 homes, and Manitoba, and they were saying, these are the three provinces that are the most undersupplied. And Manitoba is at 24,000. And when you look at Alberta, 138,000 housing units, that's 5 years of our typical housing stats on a per unit basis. So that's a lot of inventory they gotta build over the next how many years, right?
So what this all tells me, Chris, I guess, is with the demand high, with supply low, this is kind of an opportune time for investors and developers to get into this market, right?
Oh, I would say so. I mean, if you're ever trying to time a market, which is never a wise thing to do, I would say that there's a lot of things that are kind of pointing to some expected growth in terms of rental rates increasing, house prices increasing. I don't see a scenario where that's not going to happen given these fundamentals. Yeah. So yeah, if there's risks though to our economy in general. We're seeing all this inflation, so it's inflating the price of materials, it's inflating land costs, so it's making housing affordability even harder. So that can kind of push supply down a little bit. And the governments, they need to figure this out. We can't tax our way out of this supply issue. In my mind, it comes down to the local markets and the municipalities. They need the money, and they need the money to spend on infrastructure to create these new housing units in these, either it's new areas or inner city locations.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks very much, Chris, for joining us today.
Hey, Mary, I really appreciate this. Great to see you.
All right, great. Thank you. That was Chris Chornohos, who is Vice President, Valuation Advisory for Newmark. This has been Business Spotlight with Mario Toneguzzi. Thanks for joining us today.